Good evening and welcome. We'll be starting in just a couple of seconds. We're waiting for some more folks to come in. Throughout tonight's program, throughout tonight's talk, if you have any questions, just feel free to put it in the chat. Good evening and welcome to the Ferguson Library Civility Series. I'm Alice Knapp. I'm president of the Ferguson Library. Tonight's lecture is the first of the fall season. The Ferguson Library, along with its partners, the Dylan Schneider Group and Hearst Media, has hosted this series since 2012. I also want to note that tomorrow is the 30th anniversary of the Dylan Schneider Group. So congratulations to Bob and the Dylan Schneider family. Robert B. Zoellick is the non-executive chairman of AllianceBernstein, a leading global investment management firm that offers high-quality research and diversified investment services to institutional investors, individuals, and private wealth clients in major world markets. He is also a senior fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Mr. Zoellick was the president of the World Bank Group from 2007 to 2012. He was a U.S. Trade Representative from 2001 to 2005 and Deputy Secretary of State from 2005 to 2006. From 1985 to 1993, Mr. Zoellick served as counselor to the Secretary of the Treasury and Undersecretary of the State, as well as the White House Deputy Chief of Staff. Mr. Zoellick is a recipient of the Distinguished Service Award, the Department of State's highest honor, the Alexander Hamilton Award of the Department of the Treasury, and the Medal for Distinguished Public Service of the Department of Defense. His most recent book, America in the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy, was published in August. In a foreign policy review, it was noted that Robert B. Zoellick shows in this wide-ranging, highly readable account of 200 years of U.S. diplomacy and foreign policy, the United States' engagement with the world has always been a dance between two conflicting imperatives: the continent-sized pull of the ongoing national experiment and the belief that American exceptionalism can make the world. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Zoellick.
Well, thank you very much, Alice, and thanks to the Ferguson Library for the invitation for hosting me, and to Bob Dylan Schneider for suggesting this event. And Alice, I just have to add, my favorite actually Amazon review was by a woman who wrote, "My husband loves this book." I thought that one definitely didn't come from a bot. So many of you are probably a bit worn down by daily events these days. So let's step back a few years, maybe more than a few years, to the evening of February 6th, 1778. That's when Ben Franklin arrived at the French Foreign Ministry to sign America's first two treaties. As he did so, he was approached by a colleague, Silas Deane, who asked Franklin about his somewhat unusual suit of clothes. It was a suit of worn Manchester velvet. It was a blue suit. And Franklin replied, "A bit of revenge." Well, it turns out that 4 years before, Franklin had represented Massachusetts and 3 other colonies in London. And during that time, Franklin had sent to the Massachusetts legislature some letters, some private letters of the Massachusetts governor that stirred up a hornet's nest in Boston. And so in some ways, Franklin was the first American whistleblower. The King's government summoned Franklin before the Privy Council, 36 bewigged gentlemen meeting in a room called the cockpit, because that had been its use during the reign of Henry VIII. And he was submitted by the Solicitor General, Alexander Wedderburn, to a blistering attack. And for almost an hour, Franklin stood really motionless, didn't say a word. It was utter humiliation. In the London of this year, of that time period, 1774, it was a very small society. Everyone knew the others. And as Edmund Burke said, this attack was beyond all bounds and measures. Lord Shelburne, who later was the British First Minister who had the unpleasant task of signing America's Treaty of Independence, called it scurrilous invective. Franklin himself called it bull baiting. The real effect was that it turned a very loyal friend of Britain into a determined enemy. So 4 years later, in 1778, in Paris, Franklin wore the same suit of clothes that he had worn in the cockpit. So the first message is diplomacy can include settling scores. Well, it turns out that Franklin's secretary was a British spy. And the secretary sent the two treaties to London, we believe, within 42 hours. And he even shorted the market as he did so. So diplomacy also includes deceit and scoundrels. These are the stories that I use to open my book. And they try to give a flavor of tales to come, because I use stories to tell the larger account. But my account of Franklin in Paris also offers some more lasting insights into diplomacy. So consider what was going on. Franklin was trying to negotiate from war to peace and even reconciliation. He wanted good relations with both Britain and France. And certainly over the next 200 years, the United States would continue to face challenges of moving from war to peace, indeed through today. Franklin had to play a rather weak hand in this diplomacy. And this came to mind when former Secretary of Defense Mattis, after he stepped down, observed that the United States may longer have total domain dominance. Well, during much of our history, we didn't have domain dominance, and we still had to conduct diplomacy. Franklin actually was the first inventor of public diplomacy, because when he arrived in Paris, the new United States was basically unknown. France hadn't even recognized it as a country. But Franklin was famous, and he knew how to use this. His image, he developed the image of sort of the rustic American philosopher. And he played to France's sense of style. His image appeared on snuff boxes, on rings, on necklaces. Louis XVI got a little exasperated, and he gave one of Franklin's fans a chamber pot with Franklin's image at the bottom. Franklin had to negotiate with his own delegation, something diplomats have done from time immemorial. He got along quite well with John Jay. With John Adams, he observed, Adams is always an honest man, sometimes a wise man, and in some cases and in some circumstances, absolutely out of his senses. Franklin also had to deal with allies in Congress, as generations of diplomats have had to try to do. And indeed, Congress had directed the American delegation not to reach any terms unless France agreed. But Jay and Adams and Franklin decided that France's interests diverged from the United States, particularly they wanted to keep the United States east of the Appalachians. So they cut their own deal, and then Franklin had the difficult task of explaining to the French foreign minister why the United States had gone off on its own. And it's actually a very artful letter, because at the same time, he had to ask France for yet another loan. Henry Lawrence, who joined the delegation late, told Franklin that he was certain that Franklin could expect his country's gratitude, because the result that they achieved was truly extraordinary. But Franklin replied, I've never known a peace that didn't generate critics, and the biblical idea of blessed are the peacemakers may apply in the afterlife, but not in this one. This little introduction also includes some chapters or ideas about diplomatic methods. One of the skills that Franklin had, which I've observed in my own experience, and I try to draw throughout the book, is the critical need to keep your eye on the primary objective. A lot of you have been involved in negotiations. You know it's easy to get distracted with this frustration or that minor point. Very important to keep an eye on the main accomplishment. one also needed a sense of timing. In 1777, one of Franklin's colleagues was exasperated by France's failure to recognize the new United States. And he proposed that they say to the French, look, the United States is on its last legs. If you don't recognize us, we'll quit the war. Franklin decided it was better to wait. And then later in 1777, you had the victory in Saratoga. But he used that quite shrewdly. He, knowing that there were spies all around, he started to reach out to British emissaries who wanted to see if they could work out some arrangement, and that pushed the French to agree to the treaties of 1778. Franklin also made an observation that Alexander Hamilton made in the next chapter of the book, which is that small gestures can influence great people and events, which I think is an important insight in diplomacy. So why did I write this book, and what's it about? Some of you may recall Henry Kissinger wrote a book in the mid-90s titled Diplomacy. There was also about history and foreign policy. But it was very much written from a European perspective. So for some time, I've been trying to think, how could one approach this task from the American experience and bring to life some of America's ideas? So the approach I took in this book is to focus on stories about people. In some ways, it's a multiple biography, but also on particular episodes, like the one I just mentioned, because I wanted to dig into the practical craft of diplomacy. Much foreign policy in universities these days seems to be taught as variations on international relations theory. And I've tried to stay in touch with university work over the years, but I've frankly thought a lot of that background is not too useful if you have to deal with some of the challenges that I faced, whether it's German unification or creation of NAFTA or climate change treaties, or when I was at the World Bank. And so I wanted to try to explain the approach of problem solving. And it leads to a larger interest I have, which is I'd like to urge some younger generations as well to think about how do you apply history in thinking about solving about problems. In a way, the book is a series of case studies that people could ask, so what would you try to do? But also, I always enjoyed diplomatic history as a field. Some of you may know in the university world it's somewhat faded. And for a good understandable reason that there's been an interest among professional historians about drawing in underrepresented actors and perspectives, and that adds a richness to the field. But I think it lost something. So Fred Logevall at Harvard, who just produced a very good first volume biography on Kennedy, wrote a piece in the New York Times saying, why have we stopped teaching political history? And that was one of the ideas I wanted to push back. And also, in my various executive posts, I often had younger colleagues who I'm afraid I used to torture by asking how much history they knew. I'd ask them questions. I really had no sense. And insofar as they did know history, it tended to start with World War II and obviously through the Cold War. But in my view, the first 150 years are also very rich with personalities and ideas and experiences. And I wanted to try to bring some of that back to life. So just to give you a flavor of some of the chapters of the book, after the introduction with Franklin, I go on to Alexander Hamilton. Now that's notable. I'm not really starting with the Secretary of State. I'm starting with the Secretary of the Treasury, because I wanted to explain how economic statecraft was complementing his domestic economic program. I have a chapter on Lincoln and Seward, always wonderful people, but when you think about it, there's lots of books about the Civil War, battles, generals, slavery, social effects, very few about foreign policy. But this was a critical issue because if Britain and France had joined the side of the Confederacy, as they almost did in late 1861 and 1862, history would have turned out very different. So the major foreign policy challenge was, how do you thwart foreign intervention? In my chapter on Teddy Roosevelt, I try to deal with a part of his experience that most Americans are unfamiliar with. They associate him with the man on San Juan Hill or the Great White Fleet or the bully campaigner. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, the first American to do so, for mediating the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. He'd had a similar role with the Moroccan crisis. These are interesting examples of mediation, but the bigger picture here was as America was rising to a world power, he was trying to maintain the balance of power at the start of the 20th century. And indeed, the first Moroccan crisis, sort of little understood, of course, is one of those underappreciated potential conflicts on the fringe of Europe that within a decade leads to another one, the Balkans and the breakout of World War I. I try to also address some people a little less known. For example, Charles Evans Hughes, who was almost president. In the 1916 election, he loses the state of California by 3,800 votes against Woodrow Wilson. He becomes a wonderful Secretary of State, and he inherits the position, remember, after Woodrow Wilson has failed to get the Senate's ratification of the Versailles Peace Treaty, the League of Nations. And he uses the Washington Naval Conference, an arms control conference, and links it to the regional security issues in Northeast Asia at that time to reestablish the executive's role. And of course, this is lost in time because of World War II, but there's some interesting applications of arms control and regional security that I think would apply today in North Korea and Iran. And indeed, earlier this year, I wrote a little op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about this point. I talk about Cordell Hull and the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934, because for people interested in trade policy, and there's certainly a lot of that topic these days, it was a seminal move where the authority from Congress was shifted to the executive branch to do trade negotiations, which led, after the breakdown of the Smoot-Hawley protectionism in the Great Depression, to a process that survived for about 85 years until we've now had a president actually who seems more protectionist than the Congress. And so it's a very topical issue. In 1947-49, you have this huge transformation that creates the American alliance system that guides our policy for some 70 years. So I try to address the question, how did this come about after avoiding alliances for 150 years? And the interesting part, it wasn't at all planned. It came in response to a series of problems. And in this chapter, I try to draw out the role of Senator Vandenberg, because one of my themes is also the critical role of Congress in foreign policy. I have a chapter on a man named Vannevar Bush, and you wouldn't find him in most foreign policy studies. He's the godfather of an American diplomacy that leverages ongoing science and technological change. He was a key liaison with the scientific and technology community for President Roosevelt in World War II, and that is an interesting account in and of itself, with the U-boat campaign and the atomic bomb. But in 1945, he issues a report that was called Science, the Endless Frontier, that really becomes the basis of American science policy in the decades that followed. What at Stanford was called the triple helix system, the government support for basic research, role of universities and business. I wanted to include this because I think that science and technology was an underappreciated, important factor in the ultimate success of the United States in the Cold War. But also, if you think about issues with China today, this is very pertinent. And I also draw in the fact that the diplomacy of science policy is a little different. I was in charge of the US negotiations for the 1992 Global Climate Change Treaty, the only framework agreement that's ever actually been ratified by the Senate. And it is, by the way, the foundation for the work in Paris and others. So I wanted to draw attention that as you think about issues of pandemics and biological security or climate change, how do you think about interacting with diplomacy? I have a chapter on John F. Kennedy as the crisis manager, focusing on Berlin crisis, connection to Cuba, and the danger of over-reliance on crisis management, which really leads to Vietnam. With Lyndon Johnson, I focused particularly on a narrow window in late 1964, early 1965, where he really decides to Americanize the war, take over the ground forces. This has been well-researched ground by people like Fred Logevall, but I wanted to add in this chapter my experience about sort of what should have been done differently, what went really wrong here. And I identify 6 factors that could apply today as well. With Ronald Reagan, I have a chapter on the Cold War as a battle of ideas. Historians struggle with Ronald Reagan. They know he's important, but they can't quite grasp how he played such a significant role. And what I focus on is how he used oratory as a weapon. And I start with a speech he gave at Westminster in 1982 at a very difficult time in the Cold War. And what I trace is how Reagan, when he was with General Electric and when he would write radio scripts, used the writing process to develop his thoughts, to focus them with a sense of conviction. But it was also critically important that he have complementary partners, which George Shultz played in the foreign policy area. My former boss Baker did on some of the economic questions. And then I have a chapter on the end of the Cold War with President Bush 41 and Baker in the key role of alliance leadership. Now, I try to draw these tales together with 5 traditions. And I'm not heavy-handed on this because I actually want the stories to tell their own accounts as opposed to push messy facts into intellectual theoretical frameworks, as sometimes happens. But I wanted to just mention these 5 traditions. One, North America. This is interesting because if you talk to most foreign policy experts today, if you see a debate on foreign policy, people will talk about Europe and Asia and China, maybe the Mideast, sometimes Latin America, Africa. Very rarely will people talk about North America. Now, of course, North America was critical to American foreign policy in the 19th century, but it was pretty important in the 20th century too. We almost went to war with Mexico again in 1916 and 17. Some of you may know the story of the Zimmerman telegram, where Imperial Germany proposed to Mexico that Mexico join in a war against the United States, for which they would receive New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. For some reason, they left out California. Maybe that was to go to someone else. But then even in more recent times, if you think about the big showdown, nuclear showdown in the Cold War, it takes place off Cuban waters. And an issue like NAFTA, which I was involved with, was very important to see it as beyond a trade agreement. It was an important notion of a changing Mexico and how it would be embraced in a North American structure. And I came across a speech that Ronald Reagan gave in 1979 when he launched his campaign. And since we're in campaign season, this is almost unbelievable. As he launches his campaign, he says, you know, it's time that we consider the need to have Mexico and Canada be stronger than they are. And in particular, it's time that we stop thinking about our nearest neighbors as foreigners. Well, it's a little different than you hear today. Now, the point is not only the past with North America, because if you think about many issues that the public is concerned about, immigration, economics, narcotics, organized crime, environmental topics, those are at the heart of the North America agenda. And in addition, it's important to see North America as our continental base in world politics. So insofar as we have a stronger continental base of 500 million people, 3 democracies, energy self-sufficiency and ability to export, better demographics than the rest of the world if we treat our human resources as assets as opposed to threats. This can be very important for the US position globally. The second tradition is trade, transnationalism, and technology. And here, what I wanted to emphasize is that from 1776 on, American leaders saw trade as more than a question of economic efficiency. Remember, in 1776, the new United States was operating in a world of empires and mercantilism. So it was trying to pry open the governmental system for the role of private actors, which later would be called transnational actors. And over time, this became and will remain a very important aspect of our role with the world. You know, the United States has dropped out of the WHO, but the second biggest funder is the Gates Foundation. And this is a key point in understanding America's role in the world. The third is the issue of alliances, which I've touched on. So for the first 150 years after Washington's and Jefferson's cautions, US statespeople avoid an alliance role. And then you have this sharp shift in 47, 49. In effect, they're creating a new type of alliance system. I try to distinguish it from that in the past. And it's a system, as Vandenberg says, that relies as much on politics, economics, and diplomacy as it does military power. And that's certainly an interesting question on the agenda today. A fourth one is the need for congressional and public support. This is one that foreign policy experts, I'm afraid, often ignore. I worked at the State Department a couple different tours, and I was always struck by the very highly qualified career officials who would understand the formal and informal nature of other people's politics. But when it came time to the US system, it kind of dropped off with 5th grade. There are 3 branches of government. And indeed, George Kennan, this was one of his issues. You could see why they would have never sent him up to the Hill. I also wanted to draw this out because I think for a successful foreign policy, there's a question about what role will key players in Congress undertake. You see these most often in the Senate, but not only. So I mentioned Vandenberg, but if you think about people like Senator McCain, who helped Clinton on issues, if you think about Nunn and Lugar, they're very critical for a successful policy. And the fifth and last tradition is America's purpose. And I'm distinguishing this from the notion of exceptionalism that you often hear. A lot of countries feel they're exceptional. But there's no doubt that from the very founding of the country, that Americans thought they were here for a larger purpose. And the best anecdote I've come across to explain this is that for those of you that still carry wallets, someday take out a dollar bill, look at the back. You probably never studied it closely, but that's the Great Seal of the United States. And you'll see this unfinished pyramid. Notice it's unfinished. That tells you something. It's got the eye of the Providence above it. And below it, it says, Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages. So these people were thinking in big terms. Now, it's my premise that the notion of the purpose changes. At first, it's simply to survive as a republic in a world of empires. Then with the Civil War, it's to preserve the Union. In the mid-20th century, as I mentioned with Teddy Roosevelt, it's early balance of power. For Woodrow Wilson, it's to make the world safe for democracies, not necessarily make everybody into democracy, but make it safe. For Franklin Roosevelt, it's the four freedoms. In the Cold War, it's the United States as the leader of the free world. For Bill Clinton, it's the indispensable nation. And so one of the questions that I pose to readers is sort of, what will it be today and going forward? And let me just close with one point that's not from the book, but something that came out recently that might give you a little context to this. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs does an annual survey about American attitudes on foreign policy. And contrary to some of what you read, you might find the results a little bit surprising. When asked about should Americans play an active role in world affairs, the percentage are 68% yes, 30% no. And by the way, it's a bipartisan 68. Should the United States support NATO? 73%. Should the United States consult with major allies and even possibly adjust policies to meet their needs? 71%. How about trade? Is it good for the economy? 74%. Better relations with other countries? 85%. Consumers? 82%. Even jobs? 59%. So what I think this brings us about to today is there is a general, I think, appreciation in the United States among the public about supporting a foreign policy. But it always does take leadership. And here I'll share one other anecdote. Gallup did a poll in late 1945 after the Japanese surrender, and it asked sort of what do you believe are the priorities for the United States? When they came to the question about US international relations or its role in the world, it reached a high point of 7%. This is late 1945. Now by 1946, as things started to heat up, it rose all the way up to 14%. So the point is, for Harry Truman and for those that followed him, this was part of the president's job. So I'll close with this. As we face the question about our future with selecting the president and the Congress, I think this will be one of the very important issues in the ballot box, or as we now may say, in the mailbox.
Thank you. I'm just going to remind all attendees, please just type your questions in chat. And I think I'll start with one question that in listening to you talk is that, so how do we move forward from here? If we went from an alliance system now and we have a disruptor, what's next in terms, either if you're President Trump or President Biden?
Well, again, I'll be direct with you. I think if President Trump is reelected, his style has been very transactional. It's very much focused on personal relations. He'd probably feel reaffirmed in his method. I think that poses some real dangers for NATO and the trading system. There is an alternative theory that some of my friends have suggested, which is we'll call the second term Eisenhower, at least the idea that after winning and being reaffirmed, you can go play golf. But I'm not sure I'd rely on that one. In the case of a President Biden, I wrote a piece a few weeks ago in Foreign Affairs Online that sketched out an idea that I'll share with you. And it takes just a few minutes, but let me give it to you. It said, you know, obviously the people around former Vice President Biden would like to change a lot internationally. And Biden himself is interested in international affairs. I could see he'd want to be engaged in the topic. But as an incoming president, he will face a staggering agenda. He's got an ongoing pandemic and frayed healthcare system. He's got the need for inclusive economic recovery. He's got environmental and climate issues. He's got immigration issues. He's got racial issues. And one of the lessons of the American system is you can't do everything at once. And so I point out that the Carter administration, the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, all with Democratic Congresses, by the way, faced this high expectations and the challenge of how much they could get done. And recall, they all got clobbered after 2 years in the Congress. So I think that'll be, setting priorities will be very important. And here again, I'll recall sort of a caution from my former boss, James Baker, who was chief of staff to Reagan in 1981. And he said to President Reagan, you have 3 priorities: economic recovery, and economic recovery. Well, in this circumstance, I think it's a combination of rebuilding trust to have a vaccine distribution and deal with some of the issues of managing an ongoing pandemic, along with sort of economic recovery. But let me connect that to the foreign policy side. What I suggest in this piece is that the demands on a President Biden, particularly given his historical skill in working with the Congress, are going to be so great that the administration might want to consider how could they leverage those domestic issues internationally. So, for example, if you're making some progress with vaccines, you don't only rejoin the WHO, but frankly, I think you could advance a project with my former institution, the World Bank, to deal with the critical question of the distribution system for these vaccines. It's logistics change, it's cold storage, it's refrigeration systems. You could have an initiative like President Bush 43 had with HIV, AIDS, and malaria and tuberculosis, which did more for sub-Saharan Africa than probably any prior administration. So, and again, if you take something like climate change, if you have an adjustment in your carbon policy, you don't just rejoin the Paris Accord, but you combine it with an initiative to try to bring developing countries in. So for example, again, when I was at the World Bank, I saw that soil carbon could actually absorb a lot of the carbon needs. It was an estimated 13% at the time, but it could also do a lot for sub-Saharan African agriculture, or avoided deforestation, or forestation policies. Or frankly, there's going to need to be adaptation policies, energy efficiency policies, different technology policies. The question is whether you could leverage each of these. If you do something with the Dreamers and immigration, which you could probably do with executive order again, why not connect it to a North American policy with Mexico? So as you go through each of these, you could kind of see how you could combine it with your international program. And then if you think one more step, what I've talked about, biological security, environmental security issues, economic recovery, I would add to that sort of data and cybersecurity questions. That would actually be a pretty good agenda to approach your traditional allies in Europe and Asia. And then with it, some of the traditional security problems, such as weapons of mass destruction and sort of regional threats, and use that to rebuild this alliance foundation, but now in a new way, in a different way than 1947 to 49. And based on that, you turn to the 2 biggest questions we face in foreign policy, which are the future of free societies and the role of China in the system. But again, one of the themes I draw out in the book, I use the Kennedy chapter in particular on this, was that traditionally, America was often tempted to focus first on Moscow, but it tended to learn it was wisest to do so based on alliance partnerships. And that's probably the lesson Kennedy learned from 61 to 63. It was the key guiding thought of my boss, Baker and Bush, at the end of the Cold War.
Thank you. The next question. Thank you for a wonderful talk. Where do you think relations with China? Our differences seem intractable at the moment. How would you approach normalizing relations with China?
So for those of you interested, I actually It's coincidental, but the Washington Post just published online a piece I wrote today, maybe in the paper tomorrow, about my view of the Trump administration's approach to China. And I'm not a fan, I guess I'll say. I think today our relations with China are in free fall. It's not clear where the bottom is, and it's quite dangerous because I don't really think either government is focusing on sort of exit ramps, which is important to do at this point. Now, I don't believe that a Biden administration is going to be able to change this overnight, or they want to, because there's been changes in Chinese policy. The public attitude towards China has hardened. You've got a number of Democratic constituencies that are also very sensitive to China. But I think the starting point, of course, would be what can we do at home? And this goes to our strength, whether with technology or as society. Second, this point about working with allies and partners to make us stronger. And then the third point would be, I do believe the United States can find mutual interests with China. It's hard to imagine how you're going to deal with issues such as biological security, pandemics, climate change without engaging China. In my experience also in working with China, that you have to dig into some of the details of the issues. So for example, with intellectual property rights, because China is now moving up the technology ladder, it actually does a better job of protecting intellectual property rights. It's created a series of courts that now fine for foreigners about 85 to 90% of the time, but the penalties aren't high enough. So I would push for higher penalties. This problem of forced technology transfer, which has been a real threat to a lot of companies, stems a lot from the joint venture requirements. So I try to get rid of the joint venture requirements. So I could go through issue by issue, but this is kind of the hard trench work of diplomacy. And I think that in addition in the security area, in addition to our alliance posture, you're starting to see some pieces. We would need to change the nature of our force presence. Probably big aircraft carriers are now big targets. You're probably going to need to rely more on sort of a distributed system of submersibles with sort of an anti-access area denial approach. And then also on a values, what I keep emphasizing is you can work with China or authoritarian systems without ceding the high ground of where America stands in terms of its purpose in the world. And a classic example would be Hong Kong. Right now we're sanctioning leaders in Hong Kong. I ask myself, well, what would this really get you other than express your frustration? I would take the approach that Britain has taken, which is to say, let people from Hong Kong come to the United States. It's probably good for us, good for them, and it shows the fundamental difference between the two societies. So I think, as in the Cold War, there's a combination here of trying to find things that you can cooperate with, but also deter and certainly continue to carry the standard of your values. You'll hear analogies to the Cold War. I don't think it's a good analogy. You can't contain China. Frankly, I think China, while certainly Xi has stressed the communist regime within China, I don't think that's his driving force abroad. I mean, ask yourself about his relations with communist Vietnam. Instead, he basically wants, as an authoritarian country, to be treated with respect and power in the system. And I think also in terms of kind of the long-term US interest, it's important to understand what's going on in China. The challenges that China faces in terms of demographics, environment, other issues, it's not necessarily 10 feet tall as some people feel. So we have to promote our own interests, but we also have to try to find, as a starting point, some way to diffuse some of the sense of conflict, which is increasing risks.
All right, here's another one. Given the relative decline of the US economically and militarily, and the massive domestic demands on our resources, is an emphasis on restoring US hegemony at least in part misplaced?
Yeah, I've never believed that the US should or could aim at hegemony. So my story, my books tells the stories about how the American approach to diplomacy tries to create both an alliance system and an international economic system that can be win-win for us and others. And in some ways, frankly, this idea that we controlled all the levers at any point of time is one that I don't think will stand up into history. Since I worked a lot in the trade space, let me share with you one other anecdote. Sometimes you'll hear people say, well, the United States could afford to be generous in trade in the mid-20th century, but now we have to watch out for our own. So I remind people that when a man named Will Clayton, who's one of my figures I bring back in the book, was trying to create what was called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which later in the 90s becomes the World Trade Organization. He was negotiating with 23 other economies. The Congress was about ready to pass a 50% wool tariff. And Clayton comes all the way back from Geneva to see President Truman because Australia said, if you pass this tariff, we're dropping out. Britain, as the leader of the Commonwealth, said, well, then we're going. And then the European states trying to come out of World War II in recovery said, well, if Britain goes, there's not much else for us. So Clayton gets 15 minutes with President Truman. The Secretary of Agriculture gets 15 minutes. And trust me, I've been in meetings like this. The Secretary of Agriculture says, you have to sign this wool tariff bill. You'll risk losing up to 7 states in the 1948 election. And poor Clayton has to make the case for the international economy and recovery and sort of against what looked like domestic politics. Truman, to his credit, the next day says, I'm going to veto the bill and I'll actually give Clayton the authority to cut the wool tariff by 25%. And for those of you that don't recall, he did win the 1948 election. Now, my point on this is that the question is, how does the United States lead in sort of an international system? Now, coming back to the question also raised this idea of, the United States' sort of internal challenges and problems. And I tried to address that a little bit in the answer to your question about, how a new administration could approach. I don't see how you're going to deal with biological security unless you try to deal with it effectively internationally, or frankly, effective economic growth or climate change or other topics. So I'm not one of the people that feels that the traditional security agenda is thrown out the window. There's still dangerous countries and people. If Russia's playing around in our electoral system, I'd smack them hard. But I do think that the nature of how we perceive security has to change when we've lost 200,000 people to a virus. And I was on a call the past couple of weeks with one of the world's leading virologists, and he said, you get about 5 of these viruses a year that could become like COVID-19. And he said, they're often, by the way, related to the wildlife trafficking, another topic of interest I have. And so we're going to have to, not only as a country, but as an international system, be able to cope with this better.
Here's the next one. Was the Plaza Accord a good idea?
So let me explain this. This may be a little obscure to people. This was in 1985. Secretary Baker was Secretary of the Treasury. The dollar in the start of the 1980s had soared very, very high, in part because of the high interest rate policy that Paul Volcker had and inflow of capital to the United States. And it was hitting the United States trade sector very, very hard because of the exchange rate. And so the Plaza Accord was something that Baker worked out with the G7 countries, and particularly at that time, Germany and Japan. But also it was followed up by something called the Louvre Accord, which was trying to change the exchange rate value to limit protectionism and limit the strength of the dollar. I think most economists would argue that some of this was sort of happening regardless, and it was starting to have a turn in terms of the exchange rate value. It was a way of trying to signal to the international community at large some cooperation among central banks and finance ministries. People can sometimes be critical because, particularly as capital flows have increased, that would probably be harder to do. But I'll draw a more recent comparison. When I was at the World Bank in the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, you had something called the G20, which was an expanded version of the G7, which Gordon Brown, the British Prime Minister, kind of used in 2009 to kind of organize an international response. Now, it wasn't perfect, but it did limit trade protectionism. It did have expansionary policies. And I would contrast that to today, where frankly, the G20 is not doing much of anything. I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal last week saying the dangers for developing countries and the need as you approach next week's World Bank IMF meetings to pay attention to this for the nature of the recovery. But I think, so what I'm trying to emphasize is some people look at the Plaza Accord as limited exchange rate management. It's important to see it in the context, and I worked for Baker at that time, so I have some sense of this, is that it was trying to actually put exchange rates within the larger context of trade and macroeconomic coordination policy. And again, people can properly point out sometimes the weaknesses of that, but ask yourself how effectively we sometimes coordinate these policies domestically. And so, you know, the idea that you have to have perfection as your test is going to leave a lot of things falling short.
And our last question for this evening. If you were consulted by President Biden as to the first priority among our broken international relationships to try to restore, which would you tell him to address first?
Well, I build on this point that I mentioned using the Baker analogy. I think he's got to focus on the combination of the pandemic and economic recovery. For political reasons, there's steps he could also take with some executive orders and some of the other topics I mentioned. But there's always a risk. You know, a new president comes in and you're hit with too many issues. If you ask yourself, you know, if this is going well at the end of the first year, will it give him the capital to do more things? And if it isn't going well, ask yourself how things are going to go. Now, again, to be frank with you, part of the challenge is he's older, and what you're going to find is the normal interagency battles will also reflect differences within the Democratic Party, which in their campaign, they've been very effective, and I praise them for doing this instead of trying to smooth over, but those haven't gone away. So as a practical person who's worked in these jobs, I would watch very closely to see who's appointed as chief of staff, national security advisor, some of these key coordinating roles. Now, the question focused on the international, and that based on the point I mentioned, I would use that as one of my first international drivers. And just imagine the effect, not only of rejoining the WHO, but coming up with an initiative, as I've suggested, with the World Bank or others to try to, of course, vaccines are always going to be dealt with at home first. That's just a reality. But we need to be starting to think beyond that, not only because how are you ever really going to deal with a virus if it still continues to rage in parts of the world, to say nothing of the economic sort of downsides. And then I would also have an international economic component of that. I'm one of the last free traders in the world, and this is not going to be easy for Biden. But I would look to see whether there's some things one could do to, in a sense, move away from some of the conflicts, whether it be in digital trade, healthcare trade, environmental trade. You know, one of my favorites is actually, as Britain leaves the European Union, I've suggested not only should the United States negotiate an agreement, but we should do so with the 3 North American countries. Think again about the signal that sends. So part of what I'm trying to discuss in the book and with you tonight is to try to think about how people face problems in real time, but how they try to address the problem, but with an eye towards connecting dots and trying to position the United States strategically.
Well, I want to thank you because this has been a fascinating conversation. I think in something that I read, you saw yourself as a pragmatist diplomat as opposed to a schooled European, and I think that comes through very much tonight. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for everybody tuning in.
Thank you. And and we will be in touch with you for the next Civility lecture. Thank you very much for attending tonight.
Thank you very much.
Just so you know, we're still live.